We've heard all the experts tell us time and time again that diversity and inclusion is critical to protecting the ocean and the planet. But many organizations, governments, and private companies often fail to implement policies within the workplace to foster a better environment and work culture that will lead towards better conservation. I was recently contacted by a listener to tell me about a mistake that I had made in referencing the terms equality and equity. The conversation developed into a great exchange of ideas that led to this interview of implementing diversity and inclusion trainings and policies in the workplace. Christie Mazzeo-Pfoertner works with the New York Department of State and tells you how she personally got involved in becoming more aware of diversity and inclusion, which led her to volunteering to be on a working group for the department. We are going to talk about her journey on this episode of How to Protect the Ocean. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, what you can do to speak up for the ocean, and how you can live for a better ocean by taking action. And action is what we're going to be talking about today. The word of the day is DEJA. Diversity, inclusion, equity, justice, and accessibility. That's what we're going to be talking about today, but in the workplace. Like I mentioned earlier, there have been times where we hear about the inclusion, diversity, equity, justice, and accessibility has to be put into, conservation places, conservation projects, going into coastal communities and incorporating inclusion, incorporating diversity, justice, accessibility, and equity. All of these things have to be included. Yet we never really see that implementation. We never really see the policies, especially within a workplace. It doesn't matter if you work in conservation or outside of conservation. To foster a better work culture, you need to include those 5 words. That's important. And so today we're going to be talking to Christie, who is part of a work group at her department where she works to put in these specific sort of actions, these specific trainings. We're going to hear about the trainings. We're going to hear what that's done for her workplace and how she's going to take what she's learned from on a personal journey and incorporate that in her work life and incorporating that into other work groups that she's a part of. So here's the interview with Christie Mazzeo-Pfoertner. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll talk to you after. Hey, Christie, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about diversity and inclusion in the workplace?
Always. Absolutely.
Nice. I love it. So this is a really interesting episode. It's always an episode that I like to cover. It's one that I feel like I'm always learning from these types of episodes and the information that guests bring on because it's something I'm not familiar with. It's something that I find as a white guy, I don't get, I like I said, I'm always learning. I don't always get exposed to the types of things that could go wrong or could be limiting to people that don't look like me. And so it's always nice to figure out like how I can learn to be better, and also just like how we can learn in the workplace to provide opportunities for everybody. And we're going to talk a lot about sort of equity and inclusion. We're going to talk about the difference between equity and equality. We're going to talk about all that kind of stuff because that's how we met. Actually, Christie, you sent me an email, and I had made a mistake in a previous episode where I didn't sort of say it properly, where I think I was getting equity and equality mixed up. And so you said you were very nice, and you're saying, hey, I just wanted to let you know there's a difference between these two, and you didn't say the differences, or you mixed up the differences. And I was like, all right, I gotta get Christie on because she obviously knows quite a bit. And what intrigued me about this, and what the focus is going to be on today, is how to bring this type of sort of, I guess it's like a new way of doing business in a workplace, right? And to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to advance, everybody has the opportunity to contribute, and everybody has the opportunity to be happy in their workplace and to be able to be fully represented. And I think it's really important that we talk about this, not just for government or private organizations or anything like that, but just for any workplace in general. So I think this is going to have a lot of value for people just beyond the marine realm, and something that we definitely have to talk about in ocean-related workplaces and so forth. So I'm really, really excited to do this. and have this conversation. And Christie, before we begin with that, though, can you just give us a background about who you are and what you do?
Oh, sure. So my name's Christie Mazzeo-Pfoertner, and I work for the New York Department of State. And within the New York Department of State, I also have some responsibilities with regional ocean partnerships. So that'll be the Mid-Atlantic area. And within the past few years, both of those groups, my Department of State and the Mid-Atlantic group, it is Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, MARCO. They've both started increasing their priority with DEIJA, or diversity, inclusion, equity, justice, and accessibility. So I'll be using DEIJA quite a bit. So keep that
even the acronym is a mouthful.
It is. It really is. I heard somebody recently call it DEJA, and I thought,
that could work. Yeah, that could work. Okay, well, we'll see whatever you come up with. We'll be following. You've already defined it, so that's awesome. So that's great. Like it's good to get that kind of background. How did you get to work with the New York Department of State?
Oh, sure. And just as I go on talking today about everything that we discussed, just know that what I'm saying doesn't necessarily align with what the Department of State or with what MARCO's views are or their actions.
Right.
So just keep that in mind, that I'm not representing them. I'm representing myself.
Absolutely.
So a couple of years ago, I used to live on Long Island, actually. I'm up in Albany now. But I had an opportunity with the Department of State down there. So I took a job, and my whole background is marine conservation, marine policy. So it was that type of job, working with estuaries. And eventually I wanted to transfer off of Long Island, because I'm sure anyone that is in the region of Long Island knows how expensive it is. And there was a really great opportunity up here in Albany, and that's the position I'm working in now. And I'm called a Great Lakes technical specialist, Great Ocean and Great Lakes technical specialist, but it doesn't actually explain anything.
all these titles that they have, right? Yes. It's really hard to define.
Yeah, it's like, well, what do you actually do? Yeah. So a lot of what I do is, again, working with MARCO, offshore wind, and then the DEIJA efforts that have come into play. And I really, I keep saying, I'm like, even after 3 years, I still like my job. I still love what I do. It's nice. Evolving. I don't get bored. So that's great too.
That's the one thing about government too, is you can evolve. I think it never used to be that way, or there were a lot of positions that were always the same project and you would always go. But it seems like when you work within policy, you can work on different files, if that's the term. Like, I know we use that up here in Canada, like with our Ontario government and federal government. You can work on different files and you can switch out, so you can it's refreshing that you can be able to do that kind of stuff, right? And so that's always good. Now, it's interesting to like work on the policy aspect of like offshore wind, and then also work on diversity and inclusion. So how did that come about? Like, those are pretty different things when you look at what you're working on. So how did that sort of dichotomy come through?
Well, we spoke a little bit ahead of time, so I know that the murder of George Floyd was an international event in the Black Lives Matter movement. So that's really what started my personal journey. That started my personal journey of wanting to learn more, especially when Black Lives Matter movement came out. I kind of thought, well, wait, doesn't my life matter too, though? And then I started reading about what the movement was about. And I thought, oh, well, that's not at all what I thought it was. This makes total sense. And so that initial attack that I sort of felt was not warranted at all. And so that's really what drove me in. And anytime something would come up on the news, I'd go, you know what, let me look into that. Let me see exactly what this means and what they're trying to do. And that's really what got me going. And then also I do have Black family. So thinking about what people of color are going through, and imagining my brother-in-law having some of those things done to him or thought about him, it solidified that personal connection that just really broke my heart on a different level, because I was aware of racial issues and diversity and equity on some level beforehand. But this is what really catapulted me into that interest. And I love that you mentioned that ocean planning and DEI, diversity, equity really don't go hand in hand. And so I had to do a lot of learning on my own.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, since that was happening, there was a huge push for diversity and equity and inclusion. So a lot of organizations, companies were all instituting these DEI plans for their organizations, which is a great first step.
Right.
But then what? Where's the action? And so I get to bridge the gap. I get to bring what I learn to these different groups. And then once these DEI plans were set up, then there was an initiative with the Department of State. And I just thank Keisha Santiago on every level possible. She's our deputy secretary in the New York Department of State. And she wanted and initiated this working group that we have now. And we're not even a year old yet. And I've just learned so much from that working group. And I get to bring those lessons learned over into the Marco realm, which reaches the entire mid-Atlantic. So it really can go a long way in just these little steps that have occurred. So that's how the two are sort of merging together. That's where it all started.
Which I think is important to define too, because they're obviously, when you look at ocean planning, diversity and inclusion have to be a part of that. I think we've definitely revealed that, and identified that as a common thread, especially when you're dealing with a lot of different communities along the coastline that are ocean users and so forth. It definitely makes sense. What I find interesting, what you mentioned too, is the fact that a lot of these government groups and even private companies and so forth, and even nonprofit organizations, they talk about diversity and inclusion all the time. And it's always talked about, but a lot of the times when you really look deeper in, nothing's done with it. Either a working group or nothing has been set up, or a working group has been set up, but it hasn't gone further. They haven't met as much, or they haven't implemented anything, or they haven't been able to do anything. And I find that when you have this working group, it really depends on the people within the working group and the action that they take and their motivation to get things done. Do you find that that's happened with your working group, where the people who have been put on that group are saying, okay, well, let's get this stuff done. Let's set the standard of what this should look like and learn from mistakes, because it's not going to be perfect, but learn from how we do it. And just sort of as a lot of stuff in ocean planning is adaptive management, go back and be how can we improve? So how did your working group sort of be set apart from others in terms of getting things done and taking action?
Well, first, this working group was voluntary. So it was the people that had the time or could carve out the time where they were passionate about this. So I think that's important. Step number one is that if you force it, you're not going to get the passionate people to really get this moving, to find the extra time, to do the trainings, to learn the trainings, learn the new terms. So that was a great first step. And absolutely, I mean, the people in this working group are just amazing. They are so passionate. They want to have some sort of action. And so the broader reason of why this working group was put together is because the Department of State is having a DEI plan. And so the Deputy Secretary, Keisha Santiago, wanted one specifically for our department. And so that was our initial plan. So those DEI plans again, right? But then we wanted to do more with it. We didn't just want it to sit there. And so we do have a plan. We have a chair. I mean, it's an unofficial chair, but she really keeps everything moving. And then we come in once a month and we do these little trainings, learning about microaggressions, about allyship, about anti-racism, neurodivergent. I mean, a whole spectrum of marginalized people and communities. And then we get to transfer that information to the rest of our group, the rest of our office. So bi-weekly, we have a little 5 minutes and we just put these little pieces to the rest of our department so that they can learn a little bit too. And so far it's been very receptive. And when we do longer trainings, more and more people are coming to them. They're 45 minutes long. And from last year to now, it's people's interest is retained. So I find that a lot of the times people are interested and they want to learn and they want to do better, but they don't know where to start. And they feel like they don't have the time. but they're open to learning, and then they can implement these small changes as well.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. These, you talk about the trainings and putting them in a place where, you could do like a brown bag lunch or something like that. People can come in for lunch. Is that how it works? Like people can come in for lunch and then they can view a presentation or something that goes on, or is it actually carved out time over a work time for them to come in? Because the reason I ask is, I've worked in government before, and when you have to have a voluntary committee where people are trying to, find the time. Like obviously you are very motivated. Your colleagues are very motivated to get the stuff done. You've already seen action from it in the trainings, but it's also very difficult to do it from a government position because you guys are busy with other work priorities. And so it really depends. Like I said, again, it depends on the motivation of the people to do that. So when you're taking a topic that could be as sensitive as diversity and inclusion, and the topics that you're covering in terms of the training, in terms of like how to present that and when to present that. When do you present that over the workday? Is it over a lunch period, or is it over time where people are still like, this is over work time and this is part of the sort of the overall training?
So the bi-weekly staff meetings that we have are about a half an hour long, not even. So that is specifically timed out where we can provide those little pieces of information.
Gotcha.
But every month we have specific working group time where we're all working on that specific plan that I mentioned before. And then also a training for ourselves so we can better be informed and can spread that on as well. And so with the past, I think maybe the past 2 or 3 months, because again, we're a new working group, so We're still evolving in what we are doing. And I don't think it's an official motto, but we say we're not experts. We're always learning. So we don't claim to know everything. So we may make a few mistakes, but we apologize and move on. So we learn from those mistakes and then we move on. But since we've grown the past couple of months, as I was saying before, we have carved out a dedicated 45 minutes, which is voluntary, for the rest of the department to join in and listen to our official trainings, which basically goes, we learn it first within the working group. So we have 1 or 2 people that really do that background work to educate us. And then we take that and we present it in a formal setting, but it's also voluntary. So we've seen those voluntary attendees go up and up over the past few months because we're retaining interest. That's
interesting too. It's increasing and not decreasing, which is nice to see. I'm sure when the first trainings came out, people were like, "Oh, I'll just take a look and see and let you know how it goes and stuff like that." But then the interest is retaining. I think that's really nice. Have you received other feedback from those trainings, like verbally, or do you put out like anonymous surveys to get feedback in terms of how people received those trainings?
What's really lovely is that people have been coming up to our chair after the fact and sharing their stories and saying something like that happened to me, or I just love to share this story. It reminded me of this. And they share their own experiences, which has been amazing. For them to voluntarily put themselves in that vulnerable position and share something that happened that was very uncomfortable to them. I mean, it's just an honor that they would say that they know that it's a safe person to go and talk to about it.
Right.
And then that can give us ideas for potential trainings in the future if we haven't covered something along those lines, which is just fantastic. But on the other hand, we do have people that will send emails and just say, hey, it was a great training. Or we found that sometimes people are a little bit confused about the concepts. And then once you give an example, it sort of sets in stone, oh, okay, I understand what you're talking about. And that's something I struggled with when I started this journey as well, is, the terms anti-racism. And I just thought, well, what does that actually mean? And I would read these books and these articles, and it was all this jargon that I really didn't understand. But when I started to get examples of what it looks like, and what it is more specifically, instead of this grander idea, that's when it started to really sink in for me. And I find that that's what's happening with the attendees as well.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned something at the beginning when you started this journey, even before in the workplace, when you started to see everything happen with George Floyd, and that was a pretty tumultuous time, just with other things that were happening in the U.S. with sort of black victims, from whether it be from police or whether it be in other instances that could involve police. You mentioned that at first you were like, what's going on? I don't understand. Like, how is this, all about Black Lives Matter and not about all like there was a bit of a defensive thing. And I think a lot of white people feel that when they first hear these types of concepts and you hear this type of education. It's just like a different way of thinking. Once you get over that, though, you're more open to the concepts and to being like, oh, I got it. Okay, now like you kind of get it right away. Have you felt that there's been that barrier with people within the workplace that in terms of these trainings? Like, did some people get a little defensive? Maybe not out like publicly, but kind of email you or gave you that feedback, or you share the feedback of that type of concept, like within the workplace?
Actually, no,
Oh,
not that I
interesting.
know of. Yes, I think that people. I mean, I don't exactly know what it is, but it's been so prevalent the past, gosh, going on 3 years now, that
Mm-hmm.
people have heard the terms. And I think that initial defense mechanism of, what are you telling me? I'm doing things wrong. What do you mean I
Right.
have privilege? What does that mean? I have struggles too. And this
Right.
essential defense, system is really gone down a bit. And or the other thing could be, people feel that way, but they're not vocalizing it.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, the education needs to come out in a non-threatening way. So if you're aggressive about, anti-racism, for example, and someone goes, well, like I said, oh, well, what do you mean I have privilege? I have a hard life as well. If you come back at them aggressively and say, well, you know what, you do have privilege and this is why, and
Yeah.
you come at them in that aggressive manner, that's not going to make them feel safe to learn
Right.
and potentially adopt their views, instead
Yeah.
of going, well, it's one thing to not be racist, but on this other side, you're taking some action in the anti-racist realm. You
Yeah.
are looking at a system or a situation and going, you know what? That's actually racist. And then wanting to do something more than just being complacent.
Do you find also these trainings you mentioned kind of people feel safe to talk about it. Do you find colleagues have been talking to each other about it after the trainings maybe, and being more open to each other?
Yes. Yes, I have found that. I'll have people come up to me, or I'll talk to other working group members, and people have gone up to them, just with whoever, they work closer with or feel most comfortable with, and have that connection. And the conversations continue on. And it really warms my heart that people care and they want to learn more. And on the other side, within our working group, just talking about emailing and going up and talking to people, there are day-to-day things that come up, situations. There are situations that arise, and when they do, we all end up emailing each other right away and going, okay, well, this is a problem, so we're going to need to fix this. Let's work this into our next meeting somehow so it can be addressed. So we have this plan, but we're also adapting to what's happening in the now, and we're not so stringent in those guidelines. So something recent, there were some shirts that were ordered, and the women were ordered female cut or women's cut without being
tighter,
asked.
more form-fitting.
Right. And so the issue I thought about was, well, women might not want that tighter fit. That can be very uncomfortable in a work environment. And another working group member said, well, that also you have assumed somebody's gender identity. And I thought, oh my gosh. So even having multiple people with different views in our working group, just that in itself opened up my eyes. So there are these little learning moments constantly. And I really love that. Really, really love how it's developing.
Well, if you think about it too, you think about ordering shirts, or merchandise for a workplace setting. It almost feels like it's so minor in the past, like it wouldn't affect anybody, but it does. Like, and you talk about little microaggressions or micro events that happen where it's being like, well, I don't really want to wear this, and they wouldn't, it would make them feel uncomfortable. That could build up to, and other little things happening that can build up to, that workplace not being as accepting or not being as fun and, as sort of like a good exchange of ideas and things like that with certain people. But when you're able to have that openness to consider, what to do when you order, not just blindly order, here's for men, here's for women, and that's what we're going to order because that's the common thing to order. And now you're thinking, oh, well, what about other genders? So why are we making them all, let's make them all the same, or whatever the solution was in that case. That the working group and the trainings have almost allowed for that openness to have those discussions where they're not silly discussions, they make perfect sense. And they're just, again, you're just being open to making sure that everybody is feeling like they belong, right? And I think having that conversation, having that openness already, just, even though the working group's only been around less than a year, has already shown success in just having that openness to talk about those types of things, right?
And what you just described really leads into the concept of allyship, because people could sit there and have these feelings but have no safe place to go and talk about it and raise these concerns without it just being them. And to have allies, to have other people in the office that are on your side. They're not going to call what you're bringing up silly. They're going to say, okay, I hear you. I'm with you. We are going to do something to make a change so it's not all on that one person.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important that these groups exist for that purpose so people can bring them up, and it not be this really intense spotlight on them and fear of backlash or being made fun of or anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's hugely important in having that openness within a workplace to be able to share those feelings and feel comfortable sharing those feelings, not worried about how people are going to react in a negative way by sharing something as small as shirt sizing and stuff. That could go a long way to a company culture or to a workplace culture, which I think is extremely, extremely important. Which we haven't had that. Now, you mentioned before we press record. You already mentioned allyship, and you mentioned the term anti-racism. And you talked about, like, at the beginning, you talked about, like, it's almost like you have to address anti-racism, address allyship to lead to inclusion. Can you just sort of define what, like, a little bit more detail what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So, in terms of, we all sort of know what racism looks like, the overt racism where you're calling people names, you're treating them differently, etc. That's a little bit broader in terms of, it's not just the color of your skin, but we're also talking about, again, the gender, both being a female or being non-binary, religion, age. There are a lot of different categories to consider when you're talking about diversity. But specifically with racism, there's a concept of anti-racism. So it's identifying where you see some racism, a microaggression, for example, and then taking some action and stepping up and saying something. And again, in a non-threatening way. You don't have to attack anybody, but it's that added step of action. So you have to start, what I've done is adopted an anti-racist lens in which I look at everything now. Now that my eyes have been open to it, I can't see it any different. So it's
Gotcha.
getting to that place. And once you're in that place and once you can recognize these little, I think really mostly what I've learned is to look at the microaggressions and look at the reasoning behind why things are the way they are. Then once you're there looking through that lens and you're comfortable and you're knowledgeable, you can become an ally, which leads into advancing inclusion. So that's essentially what this working group does, is we are allies to each other. We are not saviors. We're not saying we're going to save you because, non-binary people weren't represented. We're going to say, no, this is important to you. This is important to us. And we are going to make some effort to correct it. So it's a partnership. It is a long-lasting partnership with any marginalized community. So with people of color as well. So when we're starting to focus in on the racist part in general and speaking about people of color, that's really where we're talking about with allyship in that sense. But it can be across any type of marginalized community. And one of the things that I've learned is a couple of different microaggressions that have come up in the workplace that I don't think I would have noticed before.
Mm-hmm.
So once you identify some of these microaggressions, for example, I've learned that people of color are interrupted 5 times more than white Caucasian people in meetings and conferences, things like that. Then you can step up and go, excuse me, Jenna wasn't done saying that. Jenna, can you just finish your thought there? I wanted to hear what you were saying, and interrupt that process in a very non-threatening way. And those little steps, you become an ally.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because I've seen that, we have all seen it happen. We just didn't recognize it when it happened. Right. And having that extra education, having that extra sort of knowledge, and just the wherewithal to look out for your fellow colleagues, and just to be like, oh yeah, you're right. And you could, like you said, you can do it in a non-threatening way, where you, like, just as you mentioned, just somebody got cut off, maybe it was by accident, but you want to make sure they finish their thought. So you kind of remember, don't get caught up in the conversation. You're always trying to remember for that person to be able to finish their thought, and saying it in a good way, where it's like, no, I want to hear your thought. Like, I want to hear you complete it. I like that. I really like that.
And it really does start with the self, because once I knew that happened, I became very conscious and made sure that I did not interrupt somebody, and was making that very conscious decision, which I can then transfer over to let other people learn about, and hopefully they can make those choices as well.
Yeah. And I think also it almost takes like a little bit of a leadership role when you do that type of looking out, let's just say, because then other people start to look out. They start to realize, oh yeah, that person got cut off, and Christie made sure that she finished her thought. I should be looking for that too. Or maybe I was the person who cut them off, and just be like, you know what? Like, even after, be like, I'm sorry. Like, I am known to cut people off. I'm a podcaster. I like to talk. I've learned through interviewing that you have to kind of hold back a little bit. I've been called out a couple of times by audience members to be like, hey, Andrew, you got to let the person talk. And so you learn over that time. But when you have an idea, you want to share it so passionately that you do end up cutting off people. And you have to recognize that. You have to really hold back to just be like, I can't, like, I got to wait till this person finishes their thought. I'll either respond to it or then add in my own 2 cents afterwards. I think that's really important. I like that.
I've done it before too. I have absolutely, and I've acknowledged it. Now that I'm aware of it, I've interrupted somebody. I go, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm just so excited. Please continue.
Yeah.
And so acknowledging it in that moment is fine too, because we're all going to make mistakes. It's okay. Just apologize and move on. And I'm sure that person will appreciate that you stopped yourself and let them continue. Yeah.
No, for sure. For sure. How many people do you have on the work group?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Does it change?
I think there's 12. Well,
that's a good amount.
Yeah, it's about a dozen. And not everybody can make every meeting. There are some people that, there are certain seasons where they go, I just have all of these reviews. I can't contribute right now. And then they circle back in a couple months whenever that's over, or they'll just attend the meeting and learn, but not be able to contribute behind the scenes for the next meeting. Gotcha. So it's very flexible that way.
And this was a voluntary thing to do for work groups. So they weren't actually chosen. Like, people weren't chosen. Did you find maybe sort of the person who was in charge of setting this up requested a few people to join, maybe people who have been advocates in the past, or was this purely like, here, this is open to anybody who wants to be a part of it, and then people put their names in and people, put their inquiries in? Is that how it was done?
So I'm sure there was some thought behind when Keisha was setting this up of who would be good for it, because she's very involved in what we're doing. So she knows us, personally. It's not like she's this hidden away person that we never see the light of day. So, she probably has expected, these people will probably volunteer for this because they find a passion for it. But I think it was set up with one person to sort of be the chair, to be the leader, to make sure it doesn't fall off.
Yeah.
And if anybody's considering trying to try to set up a working group, or just maybe it's not even a formal working group, but you want to start implementing some of these changes, it is important to have somebody that has your back, that says this is important and it's going to happen, so that there's not that backlash and people trying to shut it down. So even if you yourself want to set something up, you can go to a supervisor or whoever the person above you is and say, I want to do this. And it can be small steps. It doesn't have to be a full working group straight away. And as long as you have their support, then when people say, why are you doing this? You can say, well, supervisor says it's important, and supervisor can come in and go, yes, I think this is important. It's a very important goal for this industry, this organization, and I'm supporting her or him or them.
Right.
And so having that definitely matters, but I don't think when it was set up, she was specifically
had people in mind or anything.
Yeah.
Well, I like that. I do like that aspect as well, as, people can volunteer for it. I like having, you have about a dozen, you have a good number, so that there's always somebody at the meeting. Obviously things get busy during certain times of the year or when you're meeting. So that definitely makes sense. So, you mentioned that this is under a year as a work group. You've already seen some success, in people being more open, people sharing their stories and so forth. In the future, if you can share, what's the plan going forward? Like, what other activities, or is it more trainings, or what type of programs are you guys putting forth to try and make it even more, like, just to kind of further your success or further your steps?
For the next year, that's pretty much how we have it planned out. But we do all want this to go forward and expand. And there's not one clear path quite yet. But one way in which I've been able to take the work that we're doing in this working group is I'm bringing it to the regional group that I spoke about, Marco, and I'm bringing that knowledge to them. And so I think it's going to evolve a little bit more naturally, because since we're all passionate about it and we work with communities and other organizations, it's going to start to spill over. And when I started introducing these ideas and these concepts over into the Marco realm, they were already working on their own DEIJ statement. So that was already on their radar. And I can bring this expertise, if you will, over onto that side of things and then further the DEIJ efforts.
Yeah.
So there's an organic way that it's happening. And then there may be an official plan on down the line. But that's something that I've really enjoyed about this working group as well, is it's spilled over into my personal life. If I didn't have the knowledge of equity and equality, I wouldn't have noticed that little slip up that you had made. I wouldn't have reached out to you. I wouldn't be doing this podcast.
Absolutely.
And so it's really expanding sort of on its own, which I love. And we're planning on the regional side. We're planning a big meeting, and a lot of what I've learned, I bring into each one of those planning sessions and go, and this is something that other marine scientists or agencies, or, if you have academia here, that they can sort of take in mind as they move forward, is in the planning process, when you're having meetings and conferences and you're asked to be a speaker, you can ask and say, well, who else is going to be on the panel? And if they don't have a diverse panel, you can always point back to that plan and say, well, you know what? This doesn't align with my organization's DEI plans or DEIJ goals. So I would like you to invite a more diverse panel, and then I'd be willing to sit on it. And so there are just these small little ways that really do make a difference. And then once you learn it and you say that to somebody else, they're going to go, oh, I didn't even think about that. Okay, well, now we need to sort of figure out what a diverse panel is going to look like. And it puts that pressure on them the more people bring it up. So that's how I sort of imagine it, or see it actually in process. developing and spreading. And I've gotten a lot of good feedback. Some of it was sort of neutral at first. Nobody ever pushed back.
Mm-hmm.
But as we've progressed and I keep bringing those ideas and these little insights here and there, it's been more and more positively accepted. And, oh, that's a great idea. Let's talk more about that and how we can incorporate it.
Well, I think the benefit, too, of you having that experience with the Department of State working group and bringing it to the Marco working group is you can go through it. It'd probably be a lot, almost like a lot faster of a process. You almost have a bit of a blueprint that you've seen so far work. You kind of know maybe some of the things that don't work or some of the ideas that maybe didn't go far or didn't go for specific reasons. So you can focus on the things that will go further and that will go maybe even faster and be able to get rolled out faster. Obviously, this is a learning process, so it's going to take a long time for everybody to learn. But one thing that's different, within the Department of State is you're dealing with New York Department of State. With Marco, you're dealing with, was it 5 states? 5 states?
5 states, yeah.
5 states. So there's a bit of a difference in that. Has that come in? I mean, there are benefits, there's advantages and disadvantages to those as well. But it's pretty much Mid-Atlantic. I feel like each of those states that are part of it are fairly well aligned in their values. Have you found that there's been a diverse amount of ideas put forth, because of the different states coming from different areas?
That's a really interesting question. What I've actually found is that what I think is happening is that people are interested. I mean, the same thing that I've spoken about with the Department of State, people are interested in learning, but they don't have anything to contribute yet because they don't have the knowledge and the background. And again, it goes back to how busy people are. And with Marco, we're all volunteers.
Yeah.
When it comes down to it, Marco doesn't pay me.
Right.
So we're taking on this added work in addition to what we already do. So that's what I really think is what's happening is just that nobody has ideas because they don't have time to do the research to learn it and then to apply it. And so I feel like a lot of the ideas are coming from me, but then are being expanded upon.
Gotcha.
If that makes sense.
Yep.
And sometimes it does end up feeling hard and I feel overwhelmed. And then, I started to complain to someone and I said, you know what? I'm complaining to the wrong person. I was complaining to a person of color that I'm tired of teaching about DEIJA. Like I wanted to bonk myself in the face because they're tired their whole life. They're experiencing this every day and just a little perspective, so I had to check myself on that one.
Well, like we said, it's always a learning process and it's you start to understand a little bit of what some other people are going through. But I do think having this ability to look at it from one working group, bring it to another that's part of different states is definitely an advantage to bring those ideas, get expanded on. That's great. I think a lot of people will be able to build on those ideas. And then you have the opportunity, if something works there that you haven't discussed, back at your regular job, then you can bring that back and be like, oh, this is kind of something that worked over at Marco. Maybe this will work here. And some of them may not work. I'm assuming it's very different in terms of the different working structures, the different people that are involved. Some concepts and ideas may work in one place and not in the other. So I think that's a really interesting sort of experience to be a part of 2 sort of separate working groups. Obviously a lot of work, but it's also, 2 different working groups that can really get pushed forward, and they can lead to different things and they can build on each other. So I think that's really great. Has your department discussed with any other departments within New York State about doing the same thing, or is the Department of State? I may not be understanding sort of the role of the Department of State. Is that working? So are other departments doing that, or is this part of the process for all the departments?
So,
like Department of
Environment is huge.
yeah, I figured.
And then there are different offices that go down and trickle down. I'm not privy to what happens up at the chamber level. That's way beyond what anything that I deal with. So I'm not sure. I would have to look at other groups to see if they have working groups. I mean, and that's the other challenging part is it's not like our working group and what we're doing is up on the website.
Right.
You know what I mean? So even if I were to go look, I wouldn't see anything, but we've done a whole lot of background work and trainings and everything. And so it can be really difficult, especially when people start saying, well, nothing's actually being done. Nothing's actually changing, which I completely understand because it looks like that, but there are these inside workings that are happening. So that may be happening in other pieces of the Department of State or the, any state agency or federal or academic. So, but I just am not aware. Not that it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Or will exist in the future too. You just never know. Okay. Well, this has been, Christie, this has been amazing. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing sort of these experiences. I think that's something that it's nice to know that's happening within governments. It's happening within, and even like there's a bit of a blueprint that people can work off of. I hope people use this as a resource. But speaking of resources, do you have any resources that for the audience members here who may want to participate in a working group for their own nonprofit or for their own workplace? Do you have any resources that you can share that we can put up in the show notes or something?
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing a lot of research on my own. And even when I first started, I didn't know where to start. I didn't know where to get the information from. And that was really challenging for me. But now that I've started to really do the background work and look into what fits for what I'm doing, some resources have come up that are more helpful than others in my situation that I think others could benefit from. And one of them is The Black Agenda. It is a book that is recent. I have it next to me. Anna Gifty, and I'm so sorry if you see this, Anna, if I pronounce your name wrong. Anna Gifty Apoku Agiman. I'm sorry, Anna, if I do that. But this book, I've only read the first chapter, which is on climate change, and they've introduced me to intersectional environmentalism, which is a whole other conversation, but something that I'm also bringing into the groups now. And this was just in the first chapter. It's an amazing series of stories. So it doesn't have so much jargon that you really can't understand it. So that has been really useful. And then, my goodness, this woman, Melinda Epler, she has a YouTube channel. She has podcast, and she has a book. And those, I've been listening to those, I've been using the YouTube. I've been listening to those nonstop. Okay. She has so many different aspects on allyship, I can't even go over everything. She has over 100 episodes, but it's Melinda, Melinda Epler, Epler. And her book is How to Be an Ally, Actions You Can Take for a Stronger, Happier Workplace.
Perfect. So we'll put the links to all the podcast, the YouTube channel, the books in the show notes, and then so that people can use that as a resource if they choose to do so. So Christie, again, thank you so much for sharing all this information. I think this is really important. I think we hear a lot about the talks from different companies and different nonprofit organizations, even within sort of the ocean realm, and we don't see enough action. And I think having this shared resource, I think, could be really important in the future for people who want to help or even want to get on these committees and don't know where to start, and working groups and don't know where to start. And so I think it's really important that we share these. So thank you so much. I think this is going to benefit a lot of people, including myself. So we really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm just so excited that I got to talk about this. I really do love talking about these issues. So I really appreciate you accepting my feedback and then asking me to come on. It's been absolutely great.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'd love to have you come back on to get like a progress of the working group and other things that have worked and maybe things that haven't worked in the future. And to get it maybe in like 6 months from now, we'll see how things have progressed.
That would be great. I'm sure I will have a ton.
I'm sure. Absolutely.
I have a ton right now that we can't talk about, forever. But
yeah, no, that's fine. That's why we do multiple episodes. That'll be great. Thank you. Thank you, Christie, for joining us on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was great to have you on the program to talk about such an important issue, such an important thing that we need to implement in many workplaces. It doesn't matter whether you're in conservation or not. These are all items that we can include in our own workplaces. I know for a company that I work for, this is a big thing. This is a committee that we're going through like a bit of a rebranding, and the company's coming together, new companies are coming in, committees are being put together, and diversity, inclusion, equity, justice, and accessibility has been a priority identified in our organization. So we're going to be using a lot of these sort of items and a lot of these strategies and tips to be able to put towards our diversity and inclusion policy. So really helpful. I'm hoping that this will become a resource for some of you, just in terms of growing through your own personal journey, as I'm going through my own personal journey in becoming more aware of what's happening with different people's lives, and being more inclusive and being more aware of what I could do to help other people get to the same place that I'm at, or feel included and become more included in a diverse environment. And I think that's really important. So I hope this becomes a great resources. I'm going to put down in the show notes the resources that Christie mentioned at the end of her interview, and any others that I find. And I hope you value that. And if you have any resources that you'd like to share and you want to contact me, you can DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. You can also email me. Go to speakupforblue.com. Go to the Contact Us page. That goes to my personal email. I would love to hear from you. I want to thank you so much for joining us on this important episode of How to Protect the Ocean. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.